Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk.
I'm your other host, I guess, Bronze.
I am.
Who is not a host. He's just here, as his name entails.
Yeah, I am. Exactly.
Does that mean? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
That was a really shitty joke.
As if our humor has a reputation of being stellar.
No, I mean because he said I am. He thinks that's a joke. It's a bad one. This got derailed instantly. Anyway,
Hey, cabin fever excuse. It's the new pass. In any case, dear listener, today we have quite the topic to again segue to back into history. I suppose we still haven't broken that barrier just yet, though we hope to soon. Today's topic is absolutism, both in abstract but also in its historical social context.
I think the best place to start would be to give like the sort of historical definition of absolutism would be, and then to go from there.
yeah. I mean, what does it mean for someone to be absolutist? Does that mean they can do whatever they want? Is there restrictions? How much restrictions can there be? Or is it an altogether different definition that's qualitative and not quantitative?
Indeed. So, dear reader, one of the main issues with defining absolutism becomes right at the start, as in, where did it start? Depending upon your interpretation, or really who you ask, absolutism started as earliest as possible 15th century, well, mid 15th century, to at latest 17th century, basically. So it's quite a gap of time period for supposedly a system that rose to dominate Europe. Another important thing to note is that the term absolutism itself was only coined after the French Revolution. Very few kings used the term, and only the Sun King really had a state propaganda about being independent from his subjects. Even other absolutistic kings had different messages. Though this might seem like a segue, the mention of propaganda is very important, especially in the historical context of absolutism.
So, in terms of the historical context, I mean, you were saying earlier about how the basic definition of absolutism was if the king was able to issue letters of arrest or letters of cachet, was it?
Yeah, in France it was a lettre de cachet, but in English that would be translated as a bill of attainder.
Bills of attainders, letters of cachet. The issue is that even this definition is largely retroactive because it is almost a technicality, because after, like, I believe letters de cachet and bills of attainder only started to be seen as, the sign of absolutism, like in the 1800s, when people went back, well, not back in time, but started reviewing the facts, and okay, what separated the Renaissance from the 1600s and 1700s style of government, and that was basically it. Like that is the big thing that comes out with that the kings were able to issue these letters of attainment and cachet. The large issue is that there were never that many over the period of time. Over that entire period of time, there was never that many issued. So, like in France, I believe by the time the revolutionaries got around, 274 letters of cachet had been issued by three different kings over a period of 600 years, 250 years. So around one letter a year.
Yeah, and I mean the obviously you also mentioned earlier as well the fact that during the French Revolution they reviewed all of these and only 21 of them were overturned.
20 somethings, but yes, the vast majority of these, for quite a while seen as autocratic and unfair and unjust measures, were in fact contemporarily by revolutionaries who quite literally voted the king to have the king executed, uphold the vast majority of these quote-unquote unfair trials as being in fact fair.
Yeah, I mean the other I think the other point here really is that I think the more important thing, sort of historically, at least in terms of what absolutism was, in the sort of French sense, was a centralization of power that the King of France previously did not have, and that that sort of centralization that occurred over, with Louis the Sun King, is usually the thing that I think, insofar as there is something that was absolutist, it was the increase in centralization that occurred in France, like over like increase of the size of the state, and that historically was very useful in terms of just like prosecuting war and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I think that there is this kind of parody image that we have of what the French absolutist system is like. In part because most of our experience, most of our understanding of this system ultimately comes from the British, and they were very against the French system.
I mean, they hated the French system so much that they refused to have police because the French had police, and so they thought, we're not going to have police because that's very French.
Yeah, I mean,
which is why England didn't have, or rather Great Britain didn't have police until the 1820s.
Yeah, and I think it was specifically they didn't have like gendarmes.
Yeah, because in the French system, the army was sort of in charge of like policing, while in Britain they had a much more free and therefore English system of thief takers, which is you would pay a person to track down the person who stole your stuff, and then they would give it back to you. So essentially, you would get paid either by the victim of the crime or the government to find thieves.
Wow. Yeah. That explains where all ANCAPs came from, huh?
I mean, the bigger issue as well, though, was that in France they had like mounted police that would go along the road to like prevent bandits, which wasn't the case in Britain. So the entire sort of post-Civil War spike in banditry was entirely because of the refusal to establish a police force. I mean, like this is the kind of stuff that was considered to be absolutist. I mean, it's like, it's similar to how the Romans considered it utterly autocratic to have like brewing licenses, which was the case in Egypt, and obviously as well then post the revolution the size of the state increased again, though really the sort of fear about the size and power of the state was more a kind of it was more of an English thing, I think, than really one of the concerns in France.
The concern, the fear against strong central government has been an Anglo thing since time immemorial. Something in English, neck on a Norman yoke, something.
I mean, I think yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but that would be distracting from absolutism. And I think the thing that you can especially see with like the things that were considered absolutist by the English were like, so I mean, there was the kind of Renaissance during the Renaissance and early modern period, there was a return to the classics, essentially, and specifically Roman legal classics, and there was this creation of the idea of the free state. And the whole concept of the free state is essentially, if there exists the possibility that the government can take away some part of your liberty, then you are not free. And so basically, yeah, and then along with some other things about, like, representative government and so forth, what really came to define the sort of idea, the sort of standard against which absolutism was judged, was essentially, can the king do anything by his own will, essentially, like without sort of reference to like an act of parliament or necessarily a sort of open court. Now, obviously, like, these are things that we have in the present day in much larger, more widespread forms than they did. And I think that really is one of the key things that we often forget about these absolutist governments, is that the whole point of the centralization of kingly power in Europe was not a case that they wanted to, be epic, just have lots of power. The specific reason was the desire to increase the efficiency of the state by getting rid of lots and lots of local traditions that sort of stood in the way of government efficiency. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of why it is the case.
Another important aspect to mention about absolutism that often gets ignored is the role propaganda, or I suppose proto-propaganda, since propaganda is specifically to the masses, and this was not quite set to the masses. But a lot of absolutism is about aesthetics, even back then. As you might have noticed here, and how we mentioned, like, absolutism itself was not that radical a shift from what immediately came before it. It can be seen as a process, and at best, a process that took hundreds of years to reach any definable point. But and to bring back the example back to the Sun King, absolutism under the Sun King wasn't that much other than I have no prime minister, basically, and I can issue letters of cachet. That was what absolutism meant back then. Very little of state administration in France changed by that point. The parlements, which in this case are legal courts, still existed, and the Parliament of Paris was still incredibly powerful. The states of Aquitaine still had their provincial assemblies in full existence, and in fact, it was the southern system that was quote unquote less absolutistic but more uniform that the kings wanted to expand but failed, vis-a-vis the northern system where the provincial estates had kind of died out but were the only real place where the king could carry out, where the central government or really any policy could be carried out. So what the Sun King did, and the fact that everyone here is referring to him as the Sun King, kind of really shows that he created an idea and he sold it, that he was this all-powerful king that was beholden to none but God. And the base idea here is that he wasn't. He created that image, because every single act, although he did not have a prime minister, every single other institution of government that he had inherent remained during his reign, and he made use of all of them. He still held councils with the nobility to pass laws, and discuss policy. Though often he would veto or propose his own laws. but that is no different than what came immediately beforehand. So a lot of the notion of absolutism is, as we said, retroactive, but also directly tied to propaganda efforts from the kings themselves, particularly the Sun King. Other quote-unquote absolutist states in their propaganda often stress different values other than this. I'm beholden to none. For example, the Austrians famously to present themselves as paternalistic and the enlightened father guiding his sons, a kind of united image vis-a-vis the I am above everything else. So it's also an angle that has to be taken into account when we discuss absolutism, both in a more ancient context, but also in a more recent 1800s or so context. A fair bit of it is just that, aesthetics and propaganda, not necessarily any radical realignment underneath.
Yeah, I mean, I think what confuses a lot of people is that absolutism is in part, retroactive and cultural and aesthetic and all that, but also it discusses the nature of the king's power, not the amount of it that he has. So, I mean, often many absolutist rulers didn't have like that much real power to change things, because they were constrained by like either economic factors or other like real factors. And so it's like, but they had the nature of the power that was absolutist. Not necessarily that they had, because that would be referred to as arbitrary power, where the king can do what he wants whenever he wants all the time. I think that's where a lot of people get confused.
Yeah, like in the grand scheme of things, most monarchs, even quote unquote absolutist ones, were beholden to a number of things, not least of which because they were human at the end of the day. Like, believe it or not, but oftentimes not disappointing one's wife was often a driving force in monarchs doing or not doing X, Y, Z. The like a central issue when we talk about absolutism, and I think we like have a good base here, is that it was only named such after the fact. If memory actually serves me, it was named in Spain after Ferdinand VII died. Yeah, after Ferdinand VII died, and the liberal triennium got put into place. So the term absolutism was created as a term of abuse to begin with, and only then spread as a quote as a technical term. Another thing that we have to take into account is that absolutism often gets related to the parallel but different in air quotes, concept of enlightened absolutism or enlightened monarchism, which are both concurrent depending upon who you ask. And if you thought, oh, so wait, absolutism is just the ability to issue letters of cachet or bills of attainder, then what's enlightened absolutism? Well, enlightened absolutism has even less of a systematic definition. In the absolutism case, we can put a technical detail, a change in attitude, a variance of aesthetics, a number of still nebulous, but at least allow us to create a nebulous picture, such is straight up impossible with enlightened absolutism, to the point that the closest concise definition of enlightened absolutism I've ever heard has been the following. An enlightened absolutist king is an absolutist king who voluntarily submits himself to his own rules. This is an absurd statement because it assumes that that was not the case under absolutism. So, dear reader, you're starting to get an issue of the problems we have when discussing absolutism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very sort of vaguely defined term. So
Indeed. I mean, and now we mentioned like what was absolutism in its time. Let's move on into what absolutism was outside of its time, because let's let's use a very good particular example of this: the Carlists. The Carlists were undeniably absolutistic, if for nothing else because they absolutely despised liberal democracy and wanted to engage in a planetary crusade against it. So, suffice to say, the Carlists are not the people who are going to sit down and try to discuss the beneficence of the pluses, that's the word, of centralized benefits also of a central parliament, largely because the Carlists were extreme decentralizationists. And more to the point, were in favor of the reinstitution in some cases, creation in others, and maintenance in the three cases in the three areas that largely spawned the Carlists, which was Aragon, the Basque country, and for a short bit Catalonia. Were the Carlists wanted to maintain the fueros, which were a mixture of traditional legal rights, given in some cases given back in the medieval ages, but a few of them in the Renaissance, that essentially created regional, really, councils which defined their own manners, had their own taxation, and depending upon your interpretation of the letter of the law, their own armies. And they deemed this absolutism, almost out of spite against their liberal opponents. Yet, as you might have guessed, this is a radically different interpretation of what absolutism was for the Carlists than it actually was for the contemporaries. But the Carlist attitude does give us perhaps a more working handle. A more workable point, an opposite, by largely telling us what absolutism isn't, by stating that it is opposed to, liberal democracy and centralization, because the Carlists were also opposed to a central constitution or any sort of central legal document in abstract.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing here, at least with the Carlists, is that the Carlists, as far as I can tell, weren't really aiming for anything like absolutism. The like even sort of on an aesthetic level, and there's a kind of because there's this kind of Baroque traditionalism to or Rococo or whatever term you want to use to liberalism or to absolutism that is sort of like I think the issue here really is that if you're looking at these time periods like with absolutism, enlightened absolutism, and various feudal regimes, what and I think I don't think it's actually possible to distinguish between absolutism and like enlightened absolutism on the simple grounds that what enlightened absolutism was just the same as what the Sun King was doing, which is political modernization from above, through centralization of power, weakening of feudal aristocracy, so on and so forth. And the kind of reactionary absolutism that did exist was then coined as a term and then back applied to to someone like Louis the Sun King, which I think only really serves to confuse our discussion of this topic on the basis of the fact that it's like, if you look at what the early absolutists were doing, what the so-called enlightened absolutists were doing, they were ultimately doing the same thing.
I mean, I think it would almost make sense to say that enlightened absolutism is just absolutism, but later.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, because the other thing here is that the what absolutism really, and you see this especially at the time, like it's like Wilhelm Frederick Wilhelm I, like Frederick the Great, I think it was, the Prussian enlightened absolutist.
Yeah, he was considered sort of. He's a typical example.
Yeah.
Frederick II.
Yeah. Frederick II. Like he, like the kind of thing he was doing is basically the same, because he was essentially extension of Protestant power through Germany, and the kind of Gallican conflict that you get in France, sort of after or around the time Louis the Sun King, I think is as well just a kind of further sign of this, because what is considered, what, as far as I can tell, what is considered to be absolutism, really historically, was basically just the attempt to extend the power of the king at the expense of other elements of society, which usually ended up being the church. And
depends slightly on both the area and the exact locale. Again, like in some areas the church was already weak, and others the nobility was already weak. So who got hit largely depended upon the geographic circumscription
Circumstances.
that of the happening, rather than just being in general against the church. Though the church did get hit a lot of times.
yeah, and I think the further issue here is really that these, why I think it's necessary to bring it up is that, especially if you look at enlightened absolutism, I think explicitly enlightened absolutism was defined, and the Enlightenment in general really was explicitly defined as anti-Catholicism, essentially. Like, as far as I can tell, the whole like logic of it, especially if you look at the way that universities changed after the Enlightenment, the focus on research, was itself seen as a move away from like Catholic dogmatism and like manualism.
I mean, you see, an extremely good example of that is Joseph II. The Habsburgs were a dynasty famous for their famous for their good relations until that point, or more accurately, in living memory at that point. For good relations with the papacy, when Joseph II came to power and started his reforms, he managed to nigh on get excommunicated, and later he got overthrown in a palace coup. So,
and I mean the I think the interesting point there, I think, as well, is that a kind of interesting historical point is that when you look at these later movements, like Action Française, Carlists, that are like pro-ancien regimes, they are usually not pro, or they, by and large, they're not pro-absolutism precisely for this reason. And I think ultimately they were actually vindicated, because the kinds of centralization of power that were undertaken by these groups were like explicitly like I think there's a greater sort of continuity between the kinds of activities of the French revolutionaries and enlightened absolutism than there is between, I don't know. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you look at,
I mean, your point is backed up by the Maestre, who said the issue was not the revolution was caused not necessarily by bad nobles, but by compromising nobles who compromised with the Enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with him there, because it seems to me the kind of attitudes that were produced by the Enlightenment were ultimately anti-Christian. I think basically the kinds of elitism that runs rampant through these circles. I mean, you can go read someone like Voltaire. This kind of mocking cynicism that you see in Candida or whatnot. To me, I think that it's this kind of high level, muted. Yeah, it's this kind of high, like high sort of high bourgeois, essentially, cynicism that runs through most of what the Enlightenment, like Voltaire, or even you see this to a certain degree in Kant, that they sort of don't believe in the Christian message, essentially, especially Voltaire. And the fact that, say, things like human rights, things like the dignity of the human, that have been recognized, or have been based ultimately upon the works of people like Maritain, who was very closely related to Action Française, to me indicates at the very least that de Maistre was correct in his Enlightenment stance. I think ultimately the history has come out against the Enlightenment in terms of the way in which it approached life. I think ultimately was like self-contradictory, and I think this itself was this shows in these kinds of enlightened absolutist, like the kind of the paradox of reform from above. I think ultimately it's like, when you look at someone like Pinochet, obviously, Milton Friedman was like, whoa, isn't this just so amazing that we've had free market reforms from above? But it seems to me that these kinds of absolutist states have always done this thing of like the imposition of supposed freedom from above. There's certain vision that I think you even see it in the modern day with a lot of feminist movements, and there is this kind of I think to return it to the point about absolutism, I think underlying the logic, and where I think people like Louis the Sun King can be criticized, is specifically this attitude of reform from above, this kind of trampling disregard for local tradition, for local whatever, in favor of increased centralization to do what it
To give an even better example, and to again bring up Joseph II, who often gets forgotten, is Joseph II's modernizing and centralizing antics inadvertently spawned Belgium into existence, dear listener. When he tried to reform the administration of the Austrian Netherlands, he basically started putting a bunch of reforms without consulting the locals, without informing anyone that he was doing this. And although there were segments of the Belgian society that were pro these reforms, he implemented them in such a manner, in such a way, that it managed to alienate everyone. So bad so that the United States of Belgium came into existence during this time period, immediately before getting annexed by the revolutionary French Republic. But that's a topic for another moment. Like, there is, and to reinforce what I has been saying, no, even better. Let's bring forth a very recent example that many monarchists like to defend: the Shah of Iran and his overthrow and the eventual creation of the Islamic Republic. Those who don't know, the Pahlavi Dynasty was famously a westernizer and modernizing in its character, trying to bring Iran at the time into the fore of modernity, and basically used the Cossacks brigades to suppress any and all dissent. And by later, after Reza Pahlavi got overthrown and his son took the throne, the secret police was the one mainly doing it, because doing it with the Cossack brigade after the Soviet Union became communist, the population of available Cossacks decreased immensely.
Yeah, although the creation of the Soviet Union was something that a lot of Cossacks did try to prevent, but being the gendarmerie of the Tsars.
They're back now. So being the gendarmerie of Putin. So perhaps not everywhere, and as once they were, but they are back.
Asphalt Cossacks. I think the absolutism, I think, is interesting because why specifically I think it is interesting is because I think there is a clear contrast between the kinds of governments that were set up in England and the Netherlands and that were established in France and Austria. And I think it's an interesting question of why was it the case that you have these kinds of weird hybrid republicanisms existing, with Cromwell or whoever, alongside centralizing sort of cinephile states in France and Prussia and whoever else. Because obviously, we've mentioned this before, I think, of the fact that probably the thing that would make China that would make absolutism real was the kind of cinephilia of the whole project, and the sort of copying of Confucian practices, and that sort of, I think that sort of contrast really between this kind of is actually quite interesting in terms of, I think there is a contrast to be made between the kinds of proto-liberalisms of many of the people that supported Rump Parliament compared to the kinds of cinephilic tendencies of that you see, especially in, say, Leibniz and his influence in Germany, or same in France, where you have state reforms to be more quote unquote Chinese. But I think it's an interesting question as to why did the different places go in such different ways, especially in the context of, I think it's fair to say that the ostensible reason for the creation of the absolute state under Louis the Sun King and his successors was for the purpose of the extension of state power, for the prosecution of war. And
yeah, the absolute state is something that is directly created out of the changing nature of war. The reason that kings were often unable to centralize is because they got armies that were centralized. Because, of course, armies changed from the medieval era to what we call the Renaissance or early modern period. Namely, gunpowder was introduced. And the introduction of gunpowder did two things. One, using a musket or arquebus or whatever you want to call it takes a lot less training than being a mounted knight. And also, it allowed a large competent army to very easily destroy the castles of the aristocracy were they to revolt against the king. And so the aristocrats had to bow to the king's authority, because now he had this centralized army, which is often a mercenary army that he got, often by borrowing money. But even so, he could borrow money and crush the will of the aristocrats, and so centralize the state, because the prime duty of the aristocrat in medieval times was, of course, to provide soldiers for the king. There's the three estate division of those who pray, those who make war, and those who labor. And in that diagram, the aristocrats were those who make war. And now, they were sort of non-essential. And so that's when you get this absolutism tendency.
Yeah, it emerged before that with things like scutage becoming more common, but yeah, the maintenance and creation of new regiments, central payment, and etc., all played their part. So, dear listener, we've created a picture of what is traditionally themed absolutist, but what we could really call it is late modern state, because that's really what the term absolutism, and by and large enlightened absolutism, applies to, is to the type of statesmanship that was coming to the fore in this time period. Now, this has provided a decent technical idea and viewpoint of what was actually going on. It does fail to mention how the term absolutism gained its own life even after this. As we mentioned in the past, the reactionary Carlists are one of the angles, but on the other, quite literally on the other side of Europe, we have Russia with its notions of czarist autocracy, which is also considered a type of absolutism, though some do consider it its own unique thing. And as mentioned earlier, these two angles, vis-a-vis the modernizing centralized monarchies that we've been mentioning, both the European ones and the later Muslim examples, technically Islamic examples, because Iranians are not Muslims. Anyway, the it's this later period that also adds a lot of confusion, because then, okay, so what is absolutism? For the Carlists, it's any absolute state, quote unquote, would be any state that doesn't have a central constitution, in which the regions have tons of autonomy, etc., etc., etc. For a czarist autocrat, it would be under the edifice of orthodoxy, nationality, and royalty. The Tsar would do everything in his power to do right by his nation. While in the modernizing context, it's the king who understands the needs of his people better than they do, simply tries to reform the country to bring it to the fore. And in many ways, each and every single one of these interpretations is legitimate, in so much as they do refer to something that did indeed fact exist. In many ways, and especially nowadays, so from 1600s to 2020, basically, a lot of people nowadays interpret absolutism to just mean pre-industrial totalitarianism, which, as you might have guessed by what we've been told, by what we've been saying here, is at best an extreme exaggeration. Well, yes, one particular example amongst the many regimes we've mentioned did use propaganda to quite the effect. The vast majority of them never quite used such attempts at mass mobilization, and even the Sun King's goal of propaganda was really more for prestige's sake, rather than, say, trying to really get the French peasant behind the idea of getting triple taxation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that the propaganda of all the absolutists and autocrats of history pales in comparison to modern governments.
I mean, Pétain famously claimed that when he was given power over Vichy France, a puppet state, mind you, that he was the first head of state that had, he had the amount of power he had paled into comparison to the power that the absolutist kings ever had, and that statement still largely holds true today, on any modern Republican head of government.
Yeah, I mean, there's I believe it was Charles Coulomb said that there's never been an absolute monarchy that is as absolute as a republic.
I mean, I'd agree with that completely.
Yeah, I mean, that's very reasonable.
I mean,
completely and utterly, I think.
I mean, especially to our American listeners, compare and contrast the amount of batshit insane things your presidents can do with executive orders that we can assure you there would be nothing that the Sun King could do to even compare.
And if you think about the British Hanover kings, I mean, they pale absolutely in comparison. I mean, the autocracy of George III versus even that of any American president. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, he tried to institute a tax on paper and failed. Like that's the level of power he had.
So, the listener, we have been trying to say is that although absolutism did exist, it did not exist how it's often portrayed. It did not exist how many think it was, and most assuredly, in its own time, many saw it as either a degeneration of what was previously existing, because we had oppositions towards absolutism, especially in the French court during the Regency era. This is the French Regency era, not the English Regency era. Two different periods.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that Louis XIV had 4 different fronts, as they were called, which were aristocratic rebellions against the power of the king.
Yeah. But also, like in the court, you had some very interesting proposals for internal reforms, such as nowadays, those who know about it malign the notion of polysynoidal government that was introduced briefly during the Regency. But the other proposals, the ones that did not get implemented, because the version that did get implemented was implemented solely so that the regent could centralize his power on his hands. So the sole example was not the best example. And also famously, polysynoid is also the term that the Carlists use to their proposed ideal form of government, which is really just a return to the Habsburg administrative practices of both predating the Iberian Union, but also firmly established during the times of the Iberian Union. In many ways, absolutism refers to a nebulous collection of factors. Some of them are social economic, some of them are military, some of them are political, some of them are purely ideological. You've had people as early as the 10th century saying that a king as vicar, not as vicar of God, but as one of God's representatives on earth, should not be beholden to nobles. In many ways, absolutism was bound to be a thing, but in many ways it was never quite a thing as it is as such is typically understood. So we enter the common day era understanding of absolutism of the king can do whatever he wants, based upon often, well, simply wrong assertions or simple or straight up just lies. As we've shown, the kingdoms couldn't do all they wanted. If they did, they would probably have done not to get overthrown multiple times or get civil wars on their heads. So, all of this, dear listener, to paint a picture that maybe, perhaps, when you find you're a monarchist, when you decide to become a monarchist, perhaps give a bit more thought into what being a quote unquote absolutist actually means, because the term is extremely nebulous.
Yeah, I mean, it's not very defined. Like, what does being an absolutist today mean? Like, what does that? Because that could mean like a boundless amount of things. So I think there needs to be sort of like a more clear discourse on like what do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, I think that's I think that really is the core issue here, is that absolutism as a term refers to these variously refers to the kinds of not having a constitution, sort of reform from above, as we see with Sun King, or like any number of historical points that I don't think really are relevant to most modern forms of monarchism. Kinds of politics that we're engaged in, I don't think are particularly relevant to like what an absolutist is. And I think that is kind of the issue of like what do you mean when you say you're an absolutist? And yeah, I think that's a very good place to leave of at least a modern discourse. It's not a particularly helpful term, I don't think.
Indeed. And with that said, feel free to give us your answer to the question we've just said via either email or YouTube comment or Reddit comment, since that's where we're going to put this podcast on.
I mean, it goes up and up. I don't even know if you can leave Spotify comments or. I mean, probably, I don't know how likely it is we'll check those. But yeah, I mean, wherever you can, leave a thing.
We'll try.
Smash the like button, as the kids would say. Reblog it on your Snapstagrams, and yeah, do all the things.
Do all the things. We need the feedback. We need the feedback, goddammit. I've been one of your hosts, McCosk.
I've been Iam.
And I've been Bronze.